Today we'll continue our study of the book of Job by looking at chapters 29 through 31. This is sort of what many consider, I guess, when you read these, you could look at as, we've had a trial between Job and his friends and Job and God. And now this is Job's closing arguments. You're going to hear in chapter 29 where he talks about how good his life used to be. In chapter 30, he's going to, what I would call, give a little bit of the woe is me. And then in chapter 31, he's going to reiterate his innocence. In fact, he's going to list virtually everything he might have ever done wrong, in a sense. Is it this? Did I do this? If I did this, I'm sorry, So he goes through a litany of things that he might have done. So let's start out by looking at chapter 29, as I said, where he's going to recount everything he had. And in verse 4, he says, when the friendship of God was upon my tent. So in other words, I used to have it very good. God was always with me. But then he goes on to talk about all the good he did in the verses 14, 15, 16, 17, that area. He says that I used to be eyes for the blind. I was feet for the lame. I was basically a father to the poor. So I did all this good stuff and my life was perfect. And I was blessed in so many ways. So he just sort of summarizes the fact that he had everything going for him. And even toward the end of that chapter, verse 25, he says, I chose their way. These are the people who would be sort of following him and listening to him. I chose their way and sat as chief, and I dwelt like a king among his troops, like one who comforts mourners. So he basically starts to say, I was king. I was riding high in my life. Have we ever seen people like this that have experienced, seemingly had everything, and then tragedies befall them and different things happen? So what happens to Job, I think, would be a sort of a natural reaction. But what I find interesting, and just came up, in fact, yesterday at Mass with the priest who's going to be giving our retreat, that, if you look at what Job considers of blessings, all the good things that he had going for him, and then we look at what Jesus said on the Sermon on the Mount about who are blessed. Jesus said the blessed or the blessed are the poor, not the rich. He said blessed are the ones who mourn, not the ones that are always happy. Blessed are the meek, not the kings of the world. So I think we're starting to see a little bit of the tension, if you will, between what the world considers blessed and successful versus what God does. We then move to chapter 30. He now goes on, as I said, to start talking about the woe is me, all the things that have gone wrong in his life. He says in verse 10 that the people abhor me, they just hate me. They don't even want to be around me. They keep aloof from me. They stay away. In 16, he says, and now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have taken hold of me. 21, he says, God, you've turned cruel to me. With the might of your hand, you persecute me. And so he just started out by saying everything he had. Now he proceeds to tell us everything that he doesn't have. And he summarizes all that's been wrong going on in his life. And now in chapter 31, he's going to assert his integrity. He's going to talk about everything he did. And I'll just highlight a couple of these, which are interesting. He said, I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I look upon a virgin? He's saying, well, did I look upon a young woman like in a wrong way? Did I say, oh, she's kind of cute and I shouldn't have had? If I've walked in falsehood, he says in verse 5, if I've walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened to deceit, in other words, if I've lied. In verse 9, he says, if my heart has been enticed to a woman. So he's talking about, if he's ever been guilty of feeling an attraction toward someone other than his wife. In verse 13, he says, if I've rejected the cause of my manservant or a maidservant, in other words, if I've sort of just disregarded the needs of these people. In 16, he says, if I've withheld anything from the poor, in other words, am I guilty of doing something? Now you got to keep in mind that what Job is trying to do here is he's trying to figure out what the heck has caused all this to happen to him. And he's going through now this litany of what could I have done? He says, if I've raised my hand against the fatherless in 21, if I've made gold my trust, or I called fine gold my confidence. In other words, if I put all of my eggs in the basket of having money or wealth, am I guilty of that? And so on and so on. So I think that he basically, in this final closing argument, just finally lays it all out there and says, okay, God, I don't know what I've done. If I'm guilty of any of these things, if you think about it, none of them are major, if I murdered somebody or I did something horrible. I think what he's done is he's worked his way down now to the point where he doesn't believe he's done anything terrible. So now he's trying to figure out what minor things maybe he did, which would have caused God to inflict this punishment, or really isn't it punishment, which is what he's believed all the time. But he's going through this constant struggle. So I guess in conclusion, then, we should just understand that, what we consider to be blessed, what we have, what we don't have, how we feel about God sometimes, and how we think we might be guilty of things, and as we put this cause and effect together, I think it's just smart to always step back and realize that God is in control. God does have our backs, and sometimes suffering, sometimes pain and agony, sometimes it's not just solely being blessed when everything is rosy. Sometimes, and St. Paul says this in the New Testament, that through suffering, many times we get closer to God. And if that is a benefit that Job ends up with out of this, or if that's a benefit that any of us end up with in our lives, frankly, it is a good thing. It may not feel like a good thing, but ultimately our goal is to spend eternity with God. And so whatever happens to us, if it leads us closer to God, that is a good thing. Amen.